understand, because I think we need to understand some of those differences if we are to see what responses unions are making to the threat posed by the growth of atypical work. I don't know if you can see the numbers, but I've got here the 6 countries that are talking this afternoon. Sweden and Slovenia are also on the list. But this is just a number which indicates the proportion of employees. These are employees, these are not the self-employed, who are in unions. And one of the things that you can see very clearly is the big differences between the countries, with France right at the foot of the table and Sweden, one of the 6 countries, right at the top. These aren't new figures, but they do bring home, I think, the differences in terms of the context in which unions are operating. And I will instantly say that union membership is not the only indication of trade union strength. And if you look at France as the example, the fact that French unions have fairly recently been able to get millions of people out onto the streets on pensions issues, for example, is an indication that membership alone is not the whole story. However, one of the reasons I think why all unions across Europe are looking to organise and recruit atypical workers is because they recognise that atypical workers are an essential part of trying to maintain their strength. And if you don't believe me, let me hold up these 2 pieces of paper. This is the German metal workers union magazine saying, now we need to win more members. This is your own publication, essentially, looking at organising. So organising is clearly an issue that people understand. However, as I say, for some unions, membership is not the only way to get legitimacy. But if you look at the lists of countries here, you can see some countries where what counts is the support that you get in the elections for works councils or similar bodies. So in Spain, unions, confederations need to get 15% of the membership in order to be seen as national representative. In France, with new legislation, they need to get 8%. In Belgium, the big rivalry between the 2 confederations is expressed through the votes they get in the Works Council elections. And I hardly dare say this to an audience largely of Italians, but as I understand it at least, in Italy currently you have a new system, agreed a couple of years ago, but we agreed now, saying that what should be taken is the combination of elections for the unified trade union representation and membership. And then you have other mechanisms, such as in Poland, where it's just simply the number of members. Again, I think you need to think about, if you're looking across Europe, at what sort of unions atypical workers can join. We all tend to think that what we have in our countries is really what exists everywhere else. But that is absolutely not the case. That you have very different forms of trade union structure. You have some countries, including the UK, where you have a single union confederation. Although it's also true that between the unions in that confederation there is rivalry for members. So if you say to an atypical worker, join a union, then the next question they're going to ask is, well, which union do I join? And that seems to me must also be an issue. You must know this better than I do. That must also be an issue in the bottom group of countries, the majority of countries in Europe, where confederations are split on some sort of political, past political basis. So this is an issue. What sort of union do I join? The next issue to look at is the question of collective bargaining. And again, you've got a set of numbers for the countries that are presented here, although they are different numbers, in saying what is the level of collective bargaining coverage? And what do I mean by collective bargaining coverage? I mean the proportion of people whose terms, basic terms and conditions are set in some way through bargaining. They're not just imposed by the employer. So you see at the top, France is right at the top. It's right at the bottom of the other table. It's right at the top of this table. And one of the reasons for that is that many agreements are extended by law in France to other people who are not directly covered by who don't belong to the employers' association that signed it, but nevertheless they're extended. And you can see that you've got the UK, which was in the middle of the other table, is at the bottom of this one, and Germany, which used to have a much wider level of collective bargaining coverage, it has actually fallen down the table over the period. Spain and Italy are in a relatively strong position between something like 70 to 80%. I should say not all of these figures are absolutely certain. The way they calculate it varies, but this I think is the broad position. And the other issue is the level of collective bargaining. Are you negotiating at national level, although over lunch I was being told that Belgium, increasingly in the negotiations at national level, are becoming less important because there's so little room to negotiate. But that is the structure in Belgium. You have a 2-year deal, which then is introduced at industry level and company level and so on. You have the situation which is typical for most of the countries in Europe and typically for most of the countries in this study, in this project, where you have industry-level agreements, and then you have the situation which applies in most of the rest of Central and Eastern Europe, and certainly applies in the UK, now applies in Ireland, where agreements are being signed at company level. And that you then, the third thing to talk about here is about social dialogue. Now, if you're talking about countries in Central and Eastern Europe, it seems to me that social dialogue, in the sense of a tripartite system with employers, the unions and the government sitting together, is a crucial part of the way that it works. It's that that's introduced the industrial relations system, basically, in those countries, although it's also under attack. You also have the situation that you have, say, in Italy, as I understand it, and in Sweden, where you have big framework agreements that set rules. The obvious one, 1993, the big agreement in 1993, would set the whole rules for how people would be represented. Issues which in Sweden are also dealt with through agreements, but in Germany absolutely, in Belgium, in France are dealt with through law. You also have, in Belgium and France, you have this structure of very formal social dialogue. And then you have the UK with no social dialogue at all. So that's the sort of framework. The question is, what impact does this have on the ability to negotiate for the situation of atypical workers? And I think what you can see in countries with high level of bargaining coverage, or relatively high level of bargaining coverage, you can reach agreements that apply in some way or other to large parts of the economy, which can also cover the situation of atypical workers. So very recently this year, I think in August, possibly even later than that, there has been an agreement in Germany with the organizations, the employers' organizations of agency workers, which has set new pay rates for agency workers across the whole of Germany. Interestingly, the rates are actually lower still in East Germany than West Germany, but nevertheless those rates have been set, and they're set in West Germany at the level of the national minimum wage that the unions want, that they now hope to get, but they haven't got yet. €8.50 an hour. In Spain too, you have had the opportunity through not actually agreements, but recommendations to negotiators at national level to reach new arrangements for temporary workers, a major problem in Spain, which said that they should push for local agreements to reduce the global volume of temporary contracts. And then formal social dialogue, as you see in France, for example, that offers the opportunity to make changes that affect atypical workers across the economy. Now, I know that the agreement that was reached in January this year is controversial, and the CGT certainly does not think that it's a marvellous agreement, but nevertheless it is the case that one of the things that was decided, that it does offer this opportunity of taking these decisions, was to say that there should be new minimum hours limits for part-time workers. You shouldn't work for less than 24 hours unless it's your personal choice to do so. And also that made it more expensive for employers to take on temporary workers. Now, as I say, I know that people think that's not good enough, and there's all sorts of other things that went wrong with the agreement and so on, but nevertheless, the fact is that this form of social dialogue does offer you this opportunity. However, if you're talking about countries like the UK without social dialogue, with low levels of coverage with company-level negotiations, then the issues need to be negotiated and improved at the workplace level. So this takes us on to what's really the last bit of what I have to say, which is who represents atypical workers at workplace level. And again, I think it's very typical for us to think that the situation we have is the standard situation. But it really isn't. That the situation where you just have works councils, there are 4 countries in the EU, Germany, Austria, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, where that is the situation. In a substantial number, you have both works councils and union structures. That's the case, for example, in Belgium, that's the case in France, that's the case in Spain. If we, it's also the case in Slovenia. If we look at Italy, essentially we have just a union structure. That's how it works. It works through the unions being represented either through the RSU or through the RSA. And if you look at the UK, then essentially the structure you have is there's either a union representation, there's legal possibilities for other things, but mostly there isn't anything at all. So either you have a union or probably you have nothing. So that's, again, a difference between the countries, different in what the people in those countries can do in terms of being unions and affecting the situation of atypical workers. So what does this difference in representation mean for atypical workers? Well, it seems to me at least that in countries with works councils, first of all, they have some sort of right to be there. That is, there should, in theory, be a works council in every workplace in Germany which has at least 5 employees. We'll talk about whether that's true or not in a minute, but that is what the right is. And if they have a works council, then generally they have some sort of rights, at least to know about what is the situation of atypical workers, perhaps how many there are, how often they're being used, perhaps what they're being paid. Generally speaking, they don't have a right to determine whether they are used or not, or how they are used. They may have rights to determine working time in Germany, some rights on working time, but not those broader rights. But you can see some progress is made. For example, interestingly, a recent court decision in Germany which said that agency workers should be counted when they do the sums to say how many works council members there should be, and particularly how much free time they should have. So that's a step forward. However, in other countries, the ability to represent and to know about atypical workers at the workplace absolutely depends on the union presence. So you might consider well, works councils mean that unions aren't really necessary to represent atypical workers. You know, you've got your works council, that's fine. But all of the evidence from the countries that I'm aware of shows that that is not the case. That frequently, if you don't have a union presence, you don't have a works council at all. And there was, until very recently, a big German company, the software company SAP, which had no works council for a long time, and it was pressure from the unions that to do that. In other countries, it's a similar situation. And if you're looking to have, and in some countries as well, in Belgium, it's the unions who make the nominations to the Works Council, so you can't really separate the two. So I think although you might say in theory that's possible, in practice, effective Works Councils in the area of atypical workers, as in all other areas, depend on union involvement. So some final thoughts. First of all, I think it's important for us, in discussing things at a European level, to recognise that the context in which unions are developing their strategies across Europe inevitably are different. Different in terms of the membership, the level of membership you have, differences in terms of potential rivalries between groups, between individual unions or confederations of unions, differences in the importance of collective bargaining and social dialogue, differences in representation at the workplace. And also, and that was being shown to us this morning, there are differences in the way the law works to determine what is the route that employers take to cut the cost of labour, to use atypical workers, and to make sure that they're using as much flexibility as they can. So in Britain, in many ways now, there's no big excitement, no real need to employ lots of temporary workers to start with, because for almost 2 years, well no, for 2 years now, you have almost no rights at all. So you've got 2 years, you don't need to worry about, I'll take somebody on today, and tomorrow they'll have rights, you take them on today, and in 23 months' time you can say, well, it was nice, but no. So that, I think, is one of the ways in which clearly the legal situation affects the sort of atypical work that you see across Europe. But as I say, and as we've heard this morning and this afternoon, in all cases there is a recognition among unions that atypical workers need representation. And that is not just an action of solidarity, it's also a recognition that a failure to represent these workers, a failure to take their interests into account, mean that the position of all workers will be weakened. So this is where the information comes from, and thank you very much for your attention.